In the second part of this lecture, we will examine several types of biases that cause errors in judgment. Finally, we will look at some methods for mitigating the negative effects of noise and bias on our judgment. But first, let's return to our case about Michael Gambardi. You were to predict by assigning a single number of probability between 0 and 100 that Gambardi would still have the CEO job after 2 years. You probably found the task of judging the success of Gambardi in his role as CEO somewhat difficult. The judgment process you went through illustrates several features of the mental operation of judgment. You likely attended to some details and ignored others. For example, his Italian name, that he attended Harvard Business School, maybe that he was abrasive or that he had integrity. Selective attention and selective recall are a source of variability across people. Then you informally integrated these cues into an overall impression of Gambardi's prospects. You did not construct a plan for answering the question. Without being fully aware of what you were doing, your mind worked to construct a coherent impression of Gambardi's strengths and weaknesses, and of the challenges he faces. You most likely used intuition instead of effortful, calculating thought. You probably did not even ask yourself whether there would be a verifiable outcome. You still tried to get the judgment right. You were aware of some uncertainty in your analysis, but at some point, you decided that you were no longer making progress, and you settled for an answer. Finally, you converted this overall impression into a number of a probability of success. You do not know exactly why you responded as you did. Most likely, a number came to mind that felt right, or at least felt right enough. The feeling that allowed you to settle on your answer was an internal signal of judgment completion, unrelated to any outside information. Your answer felt right if it seemed to fit comfortably enough with the evidence. Your judgment achieved a coherence with the factors you chose to evaluate. The essential feature of the internal signal is that the sense of coherence is part of the experience of judgment. It is not contingent on a real outcome. As a result, the internal signal is just as available for non-verifiable judgments as it is for real, verifiable ones. The Gambardi judgment is an example of a predictive judgment. Since this is a fictional case, there's no way to assess the accuracy of your judgments. Many professional judgments are non-verifiable. Verifiability does not change the experience of judgment. We will turn to methods for improving judgment later. But first, we need to take a look at other cognitive operations that also cause errors in judgments. Heuristics and biases interact with noise and can result in greater error in decision-making. Cognitive simplifying operations are called heuristics. One example of a heuristic is the human tendency to generalize based on previous observations. The extreme of generalization is what we call stereotyping. These are cognitive shortcuts to reach judgments that most often do not engage effortful thought processes and reflection. Heuristics are employed in the fast, intuitive thought processes of the human mind, what Daniel Kahneman calls System 1 thinking. The theory of judgment heuristics proposes that people will sometimes use the answer to an easier question in responding to the harder one. The substitution of an easier question for the other one causes predictable errors. Errors are bound to occur when a judgment of similarity is substituted for a judgment of probability, because probability is constrained by a special logic. Here's an example of System 1 thinking. Think about two people, you and me, at a wedding reception for a couple we both know. I ask you a rather surprising question about what you thought the odds that the marriage would last 5 years. You may think about how devoted the marriage partners are to each other now and conclude that surely the marriage would last many years, if not throughout both partners' lifetimes. but you substituted your perception of the couple's current level of apparent affection for each other to answer a question about probability. But what if two of us went and attended 500 weddings and tallied up the number of marriages that ended in divorce in 5 years? What would be the number likely? The percent is a statistical base rate. When estimating probability of a singular incident or a situation, it is important to take the outside view by looking at the larger picture, outside the narrow view of the singular incident, and to assess probabilities by employing a base rate when possible. So studies suggest that 20% of marriages end within the first 5 years, and that this number increases by 12% within 10 years. The substitution heuristic led you maybe to ask the easier question, how happy do they appear now? Let's talk a minute about base rate information, base rate neglect, and outside statistical thinking. Recall the case previously about assessing the probability that Michael Gambardi would hold the same job after 2 years. Refer to the number that you wrote down. If you're like most people, your assessment of Gambardi's success was based entirely on what the case told you about him. You then attempted to match his description to the image of a successful CEO. Did it occur to you to consider the probability that randomly chosen CEOs will still hold the same job 2 years later? Probably not. The base rate CEO survival is relevant to the Gambardi problem. When you think of Gambardi as a member of a class of similar cases, you're taking the outside view. You think statistically about the class instead of thinking causally about the focal case. Taking the outside view can make a large difference and prevent significant errors. A few minutes research would reveal that estimates of CEO turnover in U.S. companies hover around 15% annually. This statistic suggests that the average incoming CEO has roughly a 70% probability of staying in the job after 2 years. Of course, this number is only a starting point, and the specifics of Gambardi's case will affect your final estimate. But if you focus solely on what you were told about Gambardi, you neglected a key piece of information. Base rate neglect can amplify errors of judgment. Substituting a judgment of how easily examples come to mind for an assessment of frequency is known as the availability heuristic. We tend to remember things we observed ourselves, vivid events. These things are more immediately available in our memories and often increase our probability estimates of occurrences. My summer home is in Alaska. I love hiking in the forest in Alaska. Based on what I just told you about my love of hiking in the forest in Alaska, what is something that pops into your mind? The ferocious grizzly bear. You're not alone. Most people think about the Alaskan wilderness as a place where you can be attacked by a bear while hiking. In fact, you're more likely to be attacked by a mother moose than a bear. There were 66 bear attacks in Alaska from 2000 to 2017, roughly. That averages to 3.7 attacks per year, while the average rate of bear attack hospitalizations is 8.6 per 10,000 hospitalizations annually. In Alaska, moose outnumber bears 3 to 1, and they injure around 5 to 10 people annually. That's more than grizzly bear and black bear attacks combined in the state of Alaska. So you probably inflated the likelihood of bear attack because the grizzly bear, it is indeed a ferocious-looking animal. It can certainly ruin your day if provoked. But it's precisely because the grizzly bear is ferocious and scary that it easily comes to mind when we think about threats in the Alaskan wilderness. Images of a bear attack are frightful and vivid, an emotional response that is easily brought to mind because it is very emotive. Here's another example I'd like you to think about in this simple word problem. A bat and a ball costs $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Most of you probably answered 10 cents, but the correct answer is 5 cents. You probably answered 10 cents because 10 cents came easily to mind. And since it came easily to mind, you judged it to be the right answer. But your intuition and the availability bias gave you the wrong answer. Look at the word problem again. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. If the bat costs 10 cents, what is $1 more than 10 cents? It's $1.10. $1.10 plus 10 cents gives you a total of $1.20, the wrong answer. We need to shift our thinking from fast, reflexive, intuitive, System 1 thinking to the slower, more effortful, reflective thinking processes that Dr. Kahneman calls System 2 thinking. Other examples of substituting easier questions for more difficult ones could be something like these. Do you believe in climate change? You might answer, do I trust the people who say it exists? Or do I think the surgeon is competent? You might answer to, does this individual speak with confidence and authority? Is nuclear energy necessary? You might answer to, do I recoil at the word nuclear? Am I satisfied with my life as a whole? You might answer to, what is my mood right now? Mood and emotion are in fact frequently overweighted. Now let's turn to a challenge that many decision makers do not deal with rationally: the unknowables and the unknowns. Consider the challenge of evaluation in personnel selection. A person who starts a new job today will encounter many challenges and opportunities, and chance will intervene to change the direction of her life in many ways. She may encounter a supervisor who believes in her, creates opportunities, promotes her work, and builds her self-confidence and motivation. She may also be less lucky, and through no fault of her own, start her career with a demoralizing failure. None of these events and circumstances can be predicted today by anyone. This intractable uncertainty includes everything that cannot be known at this time about the outcome that you're trying to predict. Furthermore, much about the candidate is in principle knowable, but not known when you make your judgment. Both intractable uncertainty, what cannot possibly be known, and imperfect information, what could be known but isn't, make perfect prediction impossible. These unknowns are not problems of bias or noise in judgment. They are objective characteristics of the task. This objective ignorance of important unknowns severely limits achievable accuracy. Yet, very often, people make judgments based on gut feeling. So when someone makes a decision based on gut feeling, what does the gut tell that person? What it is emotion masquerading as rationality. It is confidence in knowing something even though you don't know why. It's an aura of conviction of rightness or plausibility, but without clearly articulated reasons or justifications. This sense of knowing is actually the internal signal of judgment completion we discussed earlier. Yet many decision makers still trust their gut to tell them the future. This bias is called overconfidence. To Kahneman, the most persistent and damaging bias is the overconfidence bias. Making detailed long-term predictions about specific events are simply impossible. The world is a messy place where minor events can have large consequences. When they listen to their gut, decision makers hear the internal signal and feel the emotional reward it brings. This internal signal that a good judgment has been reached is the voice of overconfidence, of knowing without knowing why. This attitude amounts really to a denial of ignorance. Overconfidence bias and substitution heuristic interact to cause another bias tendency in human reasoning. Take a look at the following picture and tell me what you think is going on. It was taken on September 11th, 2001 in New York City. In his September 10th, 2006 column, Frank Rich of the New York Times describes a taboo 9/11 photo, one so shocking that photographer Thomas Hepker didn't want to publish it until 4 years later. The photo shows 5 people on the Brooklyn waterfront engaged in a conversation while the smoke from the fallen towers billows over Manhattan behind them. After calling the image shocking, Rich suggested that the 5 New Yorkers were relaxing and were already moving on from the attacks. Rich wrote, "Traumatic as the attack on America was, 9/11 would recede quickly for many. This is a country that likes to move on, and fast. The young people in Mr. Hepker's photo aren't necessarily callous, they're just American." 2 days later, after Rich's column was published in the New York Times, Walter Sipser, a Brooklyn artist who's the man on the far right of the photo, responded to the article. He wrote, "A snapshot can make mourners attending a funeral look like they're having a party. Thomas Hepker took a photo of my girlfriend and me sitting and talking with strangers against the backdrop of the smoking ruin of the World Trade Center on September 11th. We were in a profound state of shock and disbelief, like everyone else we encountered that day. Thomas Hepker did not ask permission to photograph us, nor did he make any attempt to ascertain our state of mind, before concluding 5 years later on that, quote, it's possible they lost people and cared, but they were not stirred by it, end quote. Had Hepker walked 50 feet over to introduce himself, he would have discovered a bunch of New Yorkers in the middle of a very animated discussion about what had just happened. He instead chose to publish the photograph that allowed him to draw the conclusions he wished to draw, conclusions that also led Frank Rich to write, the young people in the photograph aren't necessarily callous, they're just American." Well, the fact is, humans by nature are uncomfortable with ambiguity and the unknown. In the absence of knowable facts in ambiguous situations, humans will fill in the blanks and make up their own narratives to explain unexplained phenomenon. Even when random events occur that were impossible to predict and were completely unforeseen, humans search for ways to determine cause and effect by identifying correlations, often unfounded, that are misconstrued as causation. We come up with explanatory stories that are simple and coherent. This coherence makes us feel good. This pattern-seeking tendency is referred to as the narrative bias. It is important that we recognize this built-in mental bias because events do not come labeled as random. Instead, this must be inferred by effortful, reflective thought. Consider another example, the so-called gambler's fallacy, for example. If a coin comes up heads 5 times in a row, people will have a powerful sense that the next flip is more likely to come up tails than heads. However, any single flip has an equal chance of coming up heads or tails. Statistical thinking suggests that a coin does not have a memory. That is, the coin does not know what the previous results were. A flood this year says nothing about whether a flood will happen next year. But the intuitive mind senses that a flood this year means a flood next year is less likely. Our intuition does not grasp the nature of randomness. In hindsight, the alternative narrative are unsurprising as the main one, if the end is known. Causal thinking makes it feel entirely explainable, indeed predictable. Things can appear normal and easily explainable in hindsight because understanding reality is backward-looking. An occurrence that was not actively anticipated triggers a search for a cause, and a search stops when we get a good narrative. Think about the lead-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Many thought that it was not likely. They expressed the notion that Putin was massing forces on the borders of Ukraine just as a power play to put pressure on Ukraine to relent in its hold on the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. Even Russian soldiers had written home that they thought they were just on training maneuvers. However, after the horrible invasion happened, people reflected on Putin's action as one that of course should have been anticipated, that he had done the same thing years before in the Republic of Georgia, in Chechnya, and Syria. The hindsight bias makes surprising and unpredictable events seem completely understandable after they occur, in hindsight. Because the event explains itself as it occurs, we are under the illusion that it could have been anticipated. The illusion caused by the hindsight bias limits our efforts at statistical thinking and critical analysis in the future. Conclusion biases are prejudgments conflated as evidence supporting a conclusion. We often start the process of judgments with an inclination to reach a particular conclusion. In other words, we prejudge. We defend these premature judgments by searching for arguments that support our beliefs. We ignore arguments that challenge our beliefs. This is the effect of the confirmation bias. Closely related to the confirmation bias, when we tend to collect and interpret evidence selectively to favor a judgment that we wish to be true, we are affected by the desirability bias. Judgments often have a profound emotional component known as affect heuristic, wherein people determine what they think and believe by consulting their feelings. Strong emotional identification with one social group can produce what we call in-group bias, where people give preferential treatment to others who belong to the same group that they do. Now, I need to emphasize an important point here. Studies of perceptions about fairness, equality, equity, as well as the denial of reality, especially in political contexts, shows that the primary psychological determinant of denial is the strong emotional attachment one has to an ideology, political belief, person, or group. This is what causes conspiracy theorists to hold on to their beliefs so profoundly. A subtler example of conclusion bias is the anchoring effect, which is the effect that an arbitrary number has on people who must make a quantitative judgment. The anchoring bias suggests that we favor the first bit of information we learn. There have been numerous academic experiments demonstrating the anchoring effect of first impressions on pricing. For example, in 2006, researcher Dan Ariely asked students at MIT to bid on items in an arbitrary auction using Social Security numbers as their anchor. The researcher would hold up a bottle of wine or a textbook or a cordless trackball and describe in detail how awesome it was. Then each student had to write down the last 2 digits of his or her Social Security number as if it was the price of the item. If the last 2 digits were 11, then the bottle of wine was priced at $11. If the 2 digits were 88, the cordless trackball was priced at $88. After they wrote down the pretend price, they bid. Sure enough, the anchoring effect scrambled their ability to judge the true value of the items. People with high Social Security numbers paid up to 346% more than those with low numbers. People with numbers from 80 to 99 paid an average of $26 for a trackball, while those with numbers from 0 to 19 paid around $9. The anchoring effect has a great deal of influence in how negotiators proceed in determining sales prices on items, especially high-priced and luxury items. A description of a candidate for an executive position consists of 4 adjectives, each written on a card. The deck of cards has been shuffled. The first 2 cards have these 2 descriptors. It would be reasonable to suspend your judgment until all information is complete, i.e. until all 4 cards have been read, but that's not what happened. You already have in your mind an evaluation of the candidate, and it is positive. This judgment simply happened. You had no control over the process, and suspending judgment really wasn't an option. Next, you draw the last 2 cards. Here's the full description. Your evaluation is no longer favorable, but it did not change enough. For comparison, consider the following description, which another shuffling of the deck could have produced. This second description consists of the same adjectives, and yet because of the order in which they were introduced, it's clearly much less appealing than the first. The word cunning was only mildly negative when it followed intelligent and persistent, because we still believe, without reason, that the executive's intentions were good. Yet when it follows unprincipled, The word cunning is awful. In this context, persistence and intelligence are not positives anymore. They make a bad person even more dangerous. Attribute substitution and the halo effect are two related biases that often cause error in our logical reasoning. I'll use the example here of how to pick a stock for purchasing. Let's say you're thinking about purchasing a stock in a dating service. In fact, you met the love of your life through this dating service and you married. You are extremely happy. Is that a good reason to purchase the stock? No. In fact, you substituted the affect heuristic of your love of your partner with the attribute you should be concerned about, and that is the financial capability of the company. In fact, the way to assess financial strength and capability of a company you're thinking about buying stock in is to do your research into the financial performance of the company, called due diligence, before making a decision to buy it or not. So another example is picking a politician. Of these four men, which one do you think would make the best choice for political office? Most people pick the man in the upper right and the man in the lower left. In fact, both were crooks, caught up in the famous Enron fraud scandal in the United States in the early 2000s. But they both look good, like they'd make good politicians. Upper left is Sergey Brin, creator and co-founder of Google. Upper right, Andy Fastow, the chief financial officer of Enron who developed the fraudulent schemes. Lower left, David Duncan. He was the lead accountant at Arthur Andersen, Enron's auditing firm, who was also involved in the cover-up of Enron's fraud. In the lower right is Sal Khan, founder and philanthropist of Khan Academy, the free online education platform. When what is beautiful is good influences our decision-making, we fall prey to the halo effect. There are some biases related to machine learning that were listed in your online learning portion of this course. We'll take a quick look at them with some examples. Social bias. Available data reflects existing bias in human society prior to the creation of the model. For example, the predominance of men or male gender in tech development and innovation can result in overweighting of male values in the selection of factors or variables and proxies for inclusion in data sets for training machine learning systems. Measurement bias. Chosen features and labels are imperfect proxies for the real variables of interest. For example, using postal codes, in the United States we call them zip codes, to identify a potential high-risk loan applicant reflects measurement bias because geographic location, for example, a postal code in an African-American neighborhood or a Hispanic neighborhood, is an unfair proxy for assessing risk in any particular individual. Other factors are better assessments of risk, like credit card payment, than the neighborhood that a person currently lives in. Representation bias. The input of the data is not representative of the real world, which leads to systematic errors in model predictions. This happens from the way we define a sample, a population to create a data set. For example, the data used to train Amazon's facial recognition was mostly based on white faces, leading to problematic issues detecting darker-skinned faces. Label bias. Labeled data systematically deviate from the underlying truth due to the ambiguity or individual or cultural differences. Label bias refers to expectations that a person assigning labels to data might have for a person given a particular label. Interpretations may be flawed and therefore mislabeled. Available data may have been generated through a process reflecting discrimination, such as the systematic mislabeling of examples from specific groups caused by maybe the classifier's racial or cultural insensitivities. Algorithmic bias. Inappropriate technical considerations during modeling lead to systematic deviation of the outcome. The term algorithmic bias describes systematic and repeatable errors that create unfair outcomes, such as privileging one arbitrary group of users over others. For example, if an algorithm recommends loans to one group of users but denies loans to another set of nearly identical users based on unrelated criteria, And if this behavior can be repeated across multiple occurrences, an algorithm can be described as biased. Evaluation bias, a non-representative testing population or inappropriate performance metrics are used to evaluate the model. For example, the model you spent ages designing and testing was only correct 55% of the time, performing only marginally better than random guess. The poor results are an example of evaluation bias. By only evaluating your model on people in your local area, you've inadvertently designed a system that only works well for them. Deployment bias. The model is used and interpreted in different contexts than it was built for. Deployment bias refers generally to any bias that arises during deployment when a system is used or interpreted in inappropriate ways, perhaps not intended by the designers or the developers. Think about how the Facebook algorithms for selecting stories for people's news feeds were based on the story's frequency of shares. In other words, the more shares, the more likely the story would appear in news feeds of like-minded people. Fake user accounts were set up to generate false, sensational, and threatening stories that generated anger in readers. It is well-known in psychology that high-emotion stories, meaning angry or fearful, are shared with others much more frequently than happy stories. Thus, the downstream negative effects of fake news were multiplied exponentially because of inappropriate use of those algorithms. Feedback bias. The outcome of the model influences the training data such that a small bias may be reinforced by a feedback loop. Recommendation algorithms are known to suffer from popularity bias. A few popular items are recommended frequently, while the majority of other items are ignored. These recommendations are then consumed by the users, and their reactions are logged and added to the system, what is generally known as a feedback loop. So how many biases are there? Well, just cognitive biases, there's about 180, including heuristics. Don't panic. There are methods we can use to mitigate the negative effects of cognitive biases. First, we'll talk about rules that can eliminate noise. An algorithm is a process or a set of rules to be followed in calculations or other problem-solving operations, especially on a computer. Simple models are algorithms too. In fact, many types of mechanical approaches, from almost laughably simple rules to the most sophisticated and impenetrable machine algorithms, can outperform human judgment. One key reason for this outperformance is that all mechanical approaches are noise-free. An example of a noiseless, simple rule is the APGAR score. The APGAR score is a test given to newborns soon after birth. This test checks a baby's appearance, pulse, grimace, activity, and respiration to see if extra medical care or emergency care is needed. The APGAR score is used around the world for assessing newborns' health as they make their first breaths. Babies usually get the test twice within minutes after birth. The APGAR score has been described as ridiculously simple, but its impact is huge. The score gave physicians and nurses a requirement to look at the newborn in an organized method. Another example of a simple rule is what is called frugal models. The combination of two or more correlated predictors is barely more predictive than the best of them on its own. Because in real life predictors are almost always correlated to one another, this statistical fact supports the use of frugal approaches to prediction, which use a small number of predictors. Simple rules can be applied with little or no computation, have produced impressively accurate predictions in some settings, compared to models that use many predictors. For more simplicity, there are what American psychologist Robin Dawes called improper linear models. In 1974, Dawes proposed that instead of using multiple regression to determine the weight of each predictor for making predictions, use predictors of equal weights. He labeled the equal weight formula as an improper linear model. His surprising discovery was that equal weight models are about as accurate as proper regression models and far superior to clinical judgment. This statistical phenomenon is a result of how multiple regression focuses on the optimal weights that minimize squared errors in the original data. The formula therefore adjusts itself to predict every random fluke in that data. The challenge is that when the formula is applied out of sample, that is, when it's used to predict outcomes in a different data set, the weights will no longer be optimal. Flukes in the original sample are no longer present in the new sample, precisely because they were flukes. The new sample has different flukes, which the formula cannot predict. The correct measure of model's predictive accuracy is its performance in a new sample, called the cross-validated correlation. In effect, a regression model is too successful in the original sample, and a cross-validated correlation is almost always lower than it was in the original data. The immediate implication of Dawes' work is that you can make valid statistical predictions without prior data about the outcome that you are trying to predict. All you need is a collection of predictors that you can trust to be correlated with the outcome. Linear regression models are frequently called the workhorses in prediction algorithms. These models include simple linear regression, which are models using only one predictor, multiple linear regression, which are models using multiple predictors, and multivariate linear regression, which are models that use multiple response variables. Toward more complexity, we move towards machine learning models. What if we could use many more variables as predictors, gather much more data about each of them, analyze larger data sets that are beyond the capabilities of human analytical capabilities, spot relationship patterns that no human could detect, and model these patterns to achieve better predictions? This, in essence, is the promise of AI. Consider a model that was designed to predict the probability that people will go to movies tonight. Regardless of your confidence in the model, if you happen to know that a particular person just broke a leg, you probably know better than the model what their evening will look like. They probably won't be at the movies. When using simple models, the broken leg principle holds an important lesson for decision makers. It tells them when to override the model and when not to. One of the reasons for success of machine learning models in prediction tasks is that they are capable of discovering such broken legs, many more than humans can think of. Given the vast amount of data about a vast number of cases, a model tracking the behavior of moviegoers could actually learn, for example, that people who have visited a hospital on their regular movie day are unlikely to see a film that evening. Improving predictions of rare events in this way reduces the need for human supervision. So let's review two reasons for the superiority of rules of all kinds over human judgments. First of all, mechanical prediction techniques, not just the more sophisticated ones, represent significant improvements on human judgment. Simple rules that are merely sensible typically do better than human clinical judgment. Think back to our examples of the sentencing guidelines and the APGAR scores. Second, the data used in machine learning is sometimes rich enough for sophisticated AI techniques to detect valid patterns and go well beyond the predictive power of a simple model. When AI succeeds in this way, the advantage of these models over human judgment is not just the absence of noise, but also the ability to exploit much more information. However, many experts ignore the clinical versus mechanical debate, preferring to trust their own judgment. They have faith in their intuitions and doubt that machines could do better. They regard algorithmic decision-making as dehumanizing and as an abdication of their responsibility. Additionally, many feel that since algorithmic decision-making is not perfect, it is not a reasonable substitute for their own clinical judgment skills. Research in managerial decision-making has shown that executives, especially the more senior and experienced ones, resort extensively to something variously called intuition or gut feel, which raises the question again, what exactly did these people hear from their gut? As we've already learned, the response to gut decision-making is that it is emotion masquerading as rationality. It is confidence in knowing something even though you don't know why. It is the effect of the overconfidence bias. For these skeptics and for all decisions that are not quantifiable enough for establishing rules, simple or more complex, we look at another method to improve judgment. This focuses on improving the process of judgment itself. Improving judgments with what Kahneman calls decision hygiene can reduce bias and noise. Characteristics of good judges include task-specific skill, intelligence, and a certain cognitive style, best described as being actively open-minded. We should not expect even the best judges to be in perfect agreement given individual differences in backgrounds and experiences and perceptions. There are strategies, however, that can reduce bias and noise in judgments. People attempt to remove bias from their judgments through training and education about such biases. That's exactly what this lecture is designed to accomplish. Educate you about your vulnerability and susceptibility to biases. Sensitivity and knowledge about types of biases allows many individuals to check their objectivity of their cognitive analytical processes during deliberations, before rendering judgments, or afterwards with reflective analysis. A strategy for debiasing judgments in group settings is to designate a decision observer to identify signs of bias. The decision observer uses a bias observation checklist that follows the chronological sequence of the discussion that leads to an important decision. It's also important to follow a straightforward decision-making protocol or framework that employs research-proven behaviors that mitigate the psychological mechanisms that cause noise and bias. We will use just such a decision-making framework when we engage our ethics cases next week. An overarching strategy for reducing noise in judgment is to employ the 6 principles of decision hygiene. The first principle, the goal of judgment is accuracy, not individual expression. When judges are sensitive to the influences of noise and bias on their evaluations, they can better focus on the goal of accuracy in their judgments. They realize that their aim is not to persuade or impress others, but instead to make the most accurate and justifiable judgment that they are capable of producing in light of the inputs that they are considering. Number 2, think statistically and take the outside view of the case. Instead of thinking about a case as a unique occurrence and ascribing a specific narrative to explain it, the prudent judge takes the outside view when she considers it as a member of a reference class of similar cases rather than a unique problem. The outside view anchors predictions in the statistics of similar cases. Recall the wedding guests example and the Michael Gombardi examples we discussed earlier. This approach also leads to the recommendation that predictions should be moderate or regressive. Number 3, structure judgments into several independent tasks. Just as an algorithmic model effectively employed in information processing can eliminate error if it's constructed fairly, so too can an effectively structured decision-making model reduce errors in judgment. We will use such a tool next week. Number 4, resist premature intuitions. Because of the internal reward sensation that gives decision makers confidence in their completed judgments, decisions must be delayed until all evaluative elements are completed. Intuition need not be banned, but it should be informed, disciplined, and delayed. Number 5, obtain independent judgments from multiple judges, then consider aggregating those judgments. Because of the cascade effects and group polarization, group discussions can often increase noise. By simply collecting participants' judgments before the discussion, the divergence caused by noise becomes readily apparent, and differences can be resolved constructively. Averaging independent judgments is guaranteed to reduce system noise, but not bias. Another formal process for aggregating diverse views is known as the Delphi method. Over several iterations of evaluations, judges make their estimates and then revise those estimates in light of their colleagues' estimates and comments. All of it done anonymously so as to avoid the bandwagon effect. The eventual estimates are thereby aggregated and are also regressive. A simpler version, the mini Delphi, can be deployed within a single meeting. Also called estimate, talk, estimate, it requires participants first to produce separate and silent estimates, then to explain and justify them, and finally to make a new estimate in response to the estimates and explanations of others. The consensus judgment is the average of the individual estimates obtained from that second round. Number 6, favor relative judgments and relative scales. Because our ability to categorize points on a scale is limited, these types of judgments can be quite noisy. For example, consider a Likert scale that we discussed earlier that measures satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 equals very unsatisfied, 2 equals somewhat unsatisfied, etc. How one judge interprets his or her degree of satisfaction on that scale can be quite different from another's interpretation, even at the same numeric point on the scale. By identifying a case example familiar to everyone and locating it on a scale, noise can be greatly reduced. For example, using a past personnel selection, someone that everyone is familiar with, and locating that case or person on the evaluation scale, all judges will have more familiarity with the relative points on the scale. At least it's going to be better than if you don't use that to help define a scale. To summarize, in this lecture, we described the concept of noise, and we defined its different types. We looked at how noise can increase errors and judgment, and discussed several examples. We had the experience of making a judgment, and then we examined the psychology of the judgment process. We also examined several types of cognitive biases and how they also adversely affect judgment. Finally, we looked at how noiseless rules and decision hygiene can help us improve making sound judgments. We will put these principles into practice in the next session when we discuss the decision-making framework and employ it to make judgments in several technology-related ethics cases. I conclude this lecture by quoting Daniel Kahneman from the last paragraph of his important book. Bias leads to errors and unfairness. Noise does too, and yet we do a lot less about it. Judgment error may seem more tolerable when it is random than when we attribute it to cause, but it is no less damaging. If we want better decisions about things that matter, we should take noise reduction seriously. So this lecture was based somewhat on my own research, but most heavily on the remarkable works of the 2000 Nobel laureate in economics, Dr. Daniel Kahneman, and his co-authors, Sibony and Cass Sunstein, in their recent book, Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. Another must-read for anyone interested in improving their decision-making is Kahneman's earlier bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow. When we meet again, it will be face-to-face in the classroom, where we will discuss a decision-making protocol for performing ethical analysis, and we will engage in case studies.